The thunder rolled across Tumbleweed Creek like God himself was bowling strikes, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the whispers that followed Nora Linden wherever she went. 3 days since they'd buried Thomas, and the talk had only grown more vicious. Nora pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried through the dusty Main Street, keeping her eyes fixed on the boardwalk beneath her boots. "Morning, Mrs. Linden," called Mr. Finch from his general store doorway, his greeting more polite than warm. Nora nodded without looking up. Mr. Finch. She could feel the stares burning into her back as she passed. The sheriff's wife and her friend Miss Holloway stopped their conversation abruptly as Nora approached, their faces a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Poor thing," whispered Mrs. Holloway, not quietly enough. "Though they do say, 'Hush now,'" the sheriff's wife murmured, but her eyes followed Nora all the same. Nora quickened her pace. 6 months in Tumbleweed Creek, and all she had to show for it was a dead husband and a reputation in tatters. Thomas Linden had swept into her life in Denver, all charm and promises, convincing her to leave her position as a schoolteacher to marry him and move to this dusty corner of Wyoming territory. 1876 was supposed to be the beginning of her new life. Instead, it had become her undoing. At the edge of town stood Garrett's livery, and Nora steeled herself as she approached. The stable owner, Kieran Ironwood, was exactly the sort of man she needed to avoid, handsome, forthright, and far too perceptive. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her secrets. "Mrs. Linden," Kieran said, straightening up from where he'd been adjusting a saddle. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of wet pine bark and eyes like a summer storm, he cut an imposing figure against the morning light. "What can I do for you today?" Nora cleared her throat. "I need to arrange transport, Mr. Ironwood. A wagon, if possible." "I intend to leave Tumbleweed Creek." His expression shifted, brows drawing together. "Leave? You've only just—" He stopped himself. "When were you thinking of departing?" "Tomorrow morning, if possible. First light." Kieran studied her face, and Nora fought the urge to look away. At 32, he was only a few years older than her 28, but something in his eyes spoke of harder years, deeper experiences. "Running from something, Mrs. Linden?" he asked quietly. "I prefer to think of it as running towards something," she replied, more sharply than she'd intended. "Can you help me or not?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "I can help you, but I'm not sure you should be traveling alone. The trail to Cheyenne is dangerous this time of year." "I've made up my mind," Nora said firmly. "How much will it cost?" As they discussed the particulars, Nora felt the weight of the small pouch of coins in her pocket. Thomas had left her precious little debts, mostly, but she'd managed to sell some of her belongings to secure enough for passage away from this place. "I'll have the wagon ready by dawn," Kieran finally said, noting the details in his ledger. "Though I still think you ought to reconsider, or at least wait for the next group heading east. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Ironwood, but I'll be fine." Nora turned to leave, desperate to escape his scrutiny. "Mrs. Linden," he called after her. When she paused, he added, "Whatever you're running from, sometimes it follows you." Nora's spine stiffened. "Good day, Mr. Ironwood." As she walked back toward her small rented room behind the milliner's shop, Nora felt the whispers grow louder. They'd started the day after Thomas died, found face down in the creek, allegedly drunk. But Thomas hadn't been a drinking man, at least not the Thomas she thought she knew. The rumors had multiplied when Sheriff Dawson questioned her about Thomas's business dealings, about men he might have angered, about the argument they'd had the night before his death. "It ain't right," a voice hissed as she passed the saloon. "Man's barely cold in the ground." Nora hurried on, chin up, tears burning behind her eyes. They thought she'd killed him, or that she'd driven him to his death, or worse, that she'd been unfaithful. None of it was true, but the truth was almost as damning. She'd married a stranger, a man with secrets and debts and enemies. A man who'd left her holding the bag, literally and figuratively. By dusk, Nora had packed her meager belongings into a single trunk. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, a letter clutched in her hands, the last letter from her sister in Boston, now 2 years old. Catherine had warned her against marrying Thomas so hastily, had begged her to reconsider. Now Nora would have to swallow her pride and throw herself on her sister's mercy. A soft knock at her door startled her. She tucked the letter away and crossed to answer it, expecting her landlady with the evening meal. Instead, Kieran Ironwood stood on her threshold, hat in hand, his expression grave. "Mr. Ironwood," Nora said, flustered by his unexpected appearance. "Is there a problem with the wagon?" "No, madam, the wagon's fine." He cleared his throat. "May I come in? What I have to say shouldn't be overheard." Nora hesitated. A man in her private rooms would only add fuel to the gossip, but something in his manner suggested urgency. She stepped aside, leaving the door ajar for propriety's sake. Kieran entered, his large frame making the small room seem even more cramped. He glanced at her packed trunk, then back to her face. "Mrs. Linden, I believe you may be in danger." Nora's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "This afternoon, 2 men came asking after you at the livery. Strangers, well-armed, not the usual traveler type." His voice dropped lower. "They were asking particular questions about your plans when you might be leaving town." "Who were they?" Nora whispered, though she feared she already knew. "Wouldn't give names, but one had a scar across his chin and the other wore a silver ring with a black stone." Kieran watched her reaction carefully. "You recognize that description." It wasn't a question. Nora sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. "They worked for Harlan Wade." "The businessman from Denver," Nora nodded. "Thomas owed him money, a considerable sum." She looked up at Kieran, no longer bothering to hide her fear. "The night before Thomas died, he confessed that he'd stolen from Wade. That's what we argued about. He said Wade's men were coming, that we needed to run." "And now they're here," Kieran said grimly, "looking for what Thomas took. But I don't have it," Nora protested. "I don't know where it is or even what it is exactly. Thomas never told me." Kieran's expression hardened. "They won't believe that. Men like Wade's don't ask polite questions, Mrs. Linden." Nora's hands trembled. "What am I to do? If I stay, they'll find me. If I leave, they'll follow you," Kieran finished. "Which is why you can't travel alone." He took a deep breath. "I'm coming with you." "What?" "No, I couldn't possibly. This isn't a request, Mrs. Linden. You hired me to transport you safely, and that's what I intend to do." His eyes met hers, steady and determined. "We leave at first light as planned, but we won't be heading to Cheyenne." "Where then?" "My brother has a ranch near the Bighorn Mountains. It's remote, defensible. We can lie low there until we figure out what to do about Wade's men." Nora stood, crossing her arms. "Mr. Ironwood, while I appreciate your concern, I can't accept your reputation, my reputation." Kieran laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Mrs. Linden, with all due respect, I'm not the one this town is whispering about, and I don't much care what they say about me." The blunt truth of his words stung, but Nora couldn't deny them. "Why would you risk yourself for me? You barely know me." Kieran's expression softened slightly. "I know enough. I know you're not what they say you are." "And what do they say?" "That doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is getting you to safety." Nora studied him, trying to discern his motives. In the 6 months since moving to Tumbleweed Creek, she'd exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with Kieran Ironwood. He'd always been polite but distant, a man who kept to himself except when business required otherwise. "How can I trust you?" she asked finally. His answer came without hesitation. "You can't, not yet, but right now I'm the only chance you've got." The terrible truth of his words settled over Nora. She was alone in a town that had already convicted her in whispers, with dangerous men closing in. Whatever Kieran's motives, he was offering her a lifeline. "Very well," she said at last. "We leave at dawn." Kieran nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Pack light, leave the trunk, it'll only slow us down. I'll come for you before first light." He moved toward the door, then paused. "And Mrs. Linden, sleep with that door barred tonight." After he left, Nora sank back onto the bed, her mind racing. In less than 24 hours, her plan to slip away in shame had transformed into a desperate flight for her life, with a virtual stranger as her only ally. She reached for the locket around her neck, her mother's, containing a tiny portrait of her parents. The only thing she had left of her life before Thomas, before all of this. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered to the empty room. Outside, the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. Nora Linden barred her door, repacked her belongings into a small satchel, and waited for dawn, knowing sleep would be impossible. 3 streets away, Kieran Ironwood made his own preparations, cleaning his Winchester rifle by lamplight, his weathered face set in determined lines. The stable boy, young Jamie, watched with curious eyes. "You really leaving, Mr. Ironwood?" the boy asked. "For a spell," Kieran replied, working oil into the rifle's action. "You remember what I told you about running things?" Jamie nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir, and Mr. Garrett's coming back next week anyhow." "That's right." Kieran set the rifle aside and fixed the boy with a serious look. "Jamie, if anyone comes asking after me or Mrs. Linden, anyone at all, you don't know nothing. Understand?" The boy's eyes widened. "Yes, sir. Is Mrs. Linden in some kind of trouble?" Kieran's mouth set in a grim line. "We all get in trouble sometimes, Jamie. The measure of a person is who stands beside them when it happens." He reached for his saddlebags. "Now go on home. Dawn comes early." After the boy left, Kieran sat alone in his small room above the livery, listening to the horses shifting below. He hadn't told Nora everything hadn't told her, that he'd been watching Thomas Linden for weeks before his death, suspicious of the man's comings and goings. Hadn't told her that he'd seen Thomas arguing with a scarred man at the edge of town 3 days before his body was found. And he certainly hadn't told her about the package Thomas had pressed into his hands the very night he died, wild-eyed and desperate. "If anything happens to me," Thomas had said, "give this to my wife. Tell her to run." Kieran had the package still, hidden beneath a floorboard in his room. He hadn't opened it, and he hadn't given it to Nora. Not yet. First, he needed to know if she was involved in whatever scheme had gotten her husband killed. But watching her these past few days, the dignity with which she bore the town's cruelty, the determination in her eyes even as her world collapsed, Kieran was increasingly certain that Nora Linden was as much a victim as anyone. Tomorrow, they would leave Tumbleweed Creek together. And somehow he would keep her safe from Wade's men, from the package secrets, and perhaps even from the truth about her husband. Kieran checked his pocket watch. 7 hours until dawn. 7 hours to prepare for whatever lay ahead. The night passed with excruciating slowness for Nora. Every creak of the boarding house settling made her start. Every distant voice from the saloon sent her heart racing. By the time the sky began to lighten from black to deepest blue, she was exhausted but alert, her satchel ready by the door. The soft knock, when it came, was so quiet she almost missed it. 3 gentle taps, a pause, then 2 more. Nora unbarred the door to find Kieran, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. "Ready," he whispered. Nora nodded, slipping her shawl around her shoulders and picking up her satchel. She took one last look at the small room that had been her home, such as it was, and stepped out into the cool morning air. Tumbleweed Creek was silent and still, most of its inhabitants sleeping off the previous night's revelry. Kieran led her through back alleys toward the livery, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. Nora struggled to keep up, her heart pounding with each shadow they passed. At the livery, a wagon stood ready, hitched to 2 sturdy horses. Not the larger passenger wagon she'd expected, but a smaller buckboard with high sides. "Better for speed," Kieran explained, seeing her expression, "and less noticeable." He helped her up onto the seat, then secured her satchel under a canvas cover in the back. Nora noticed supplies already loaded: food, water barrels, blankets, and what looked like several guns wrapped in oilcloth. "You've been planning this," she said as he climbed up beside her. Kieran took up the reins. "Let's just say I like to be prepared." He clicked softly to the horses, and they moved forward, their hooves muffled by cloth wrapped around each foot. "We'll remove those once we're clear of town," he explained, nodding toward the horses' feet. They moved slowly through Tumbleweed Creek, the wagon's wheels crunching softly on the packed dirt. Nora held her breath as they passed the sheriff's office, but the windows remained dark. At the edge of town, where the main road split north toward the mountains and east toward Cheyenne, Kieran surprised her by turning the wagon onto a narrow trail heading northwest. This isn't the main road, Nora observed. That's the idea. Kieran glanced over his shoulder, scanning the town behind them. Anyone looking for us will expect us to take the Cheyenne Road. This old trail connects with the North Road eventually, but it'll buy us some time. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in pinks and golds, Tumbleweed Creek receded behind them. Nora felt a curious mixture of relief and trepidation. She was leaving behind the whispers and accusatory glances, but heading into unknown territory with a man she barely knew, pursued by dangerous enemies. "Mr. Ironwood," she said after they'd traveled in silence for some time, "I appreciate what you're doing, but I feel I should know more about you if we're to be traveling together." Kieran kept his eyes on the trail. Not much to tell. "I grew up on a ranch near the Bighorns with my brother Nathan. Fought for the Union in '63 and '64, drifted for a while after the war, then settled in Tumbleweed 3 years ago when Garrett needed someone to run his livery." "You were in the war." Nora looked at him with new interest. "My father and brother both fought. Father didn't come home." Kieran's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Too many good men didn't." "Is that why you left your brother's ranch, the war?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Partly. Nathan and I had differences after I returned. Took some time apart to sort things out." Nora sensed there was more to that story but didn't press. "And now we're heading there. Will he welcome us?" "Nathan's a good man," Kieran said simply. "He'll help." They lapsed into silence again as Kieran stopped the wagon to remove the cloth from the horse's hooves. The sun was fully up now, revealing a landscape of rolling prairie dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of pine. In the far distance, the mountains rose like a promise or a warning. "We'll stop midday to rest the horses," Kieran said as they continued on. "Make camp tonight near the fork of the Powder River. From there, it's 2 more days to Nathan's place." Nora nodded, then gathered her courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since the previous evening. "Mr. Ironwood, how much do you know about my husband's activities?" Kieran's hands tightened on the reins, enough to know he was in over his head. "Did you know he was a thief?" The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. Kieran glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I suspected he wasn't entirely what he claimed to be." "That makes 2 of us," Nora said quietly, looking down at her hands. "I thought I knew him. We courted for only a month before marrying, but he was so charming, so sure of everything." She gave a hollow laugh. "I was a schoolteacher." "I should have been smarter." "Smart has nothing to do with it," Kieran replied. "Some men make deceiving others their life's work. Thomas Linden was one of them." The blunt assessment stung, but Nora couldn't deny its truth. "So you knew. All this time, while I was playing the devoted wife, you knew he was a fraud." "I had suspicions," Kieran corrected. "Nothing more until recently." Nora turned to face him fully. "Recently? What do you mean?" Kieran was silent for a long moment, seemingly debating with himself. Finally, he said, "The night Thomas died, he came to see me. He was agitated, said men were after him. He gave me something to keep safe." "What?" Nora's heart raced. "What did he give you?" "A package, small, wrapped in oilskin. I don't know what's inside, I didn't open it." "You've had it all this time." Nora's voice rose with indignation. "Why didn't you tell me? Give it to me." "Because I didn't know if you were involved," Kieran said bluntly. "And because whatever's in that package got your husband killed." "I needed to be sure giving it to you wouldn't get you killed too." Nora stared at him, speechless with anger and confusion. "Where is it now? Did you bring it?" Kieran nodded toward the wagon bed behind them. "It's secured, and before you ask, no, you can't see it yet." "Not until we're somewhere safe." "It's mine," Nora protested. "Thomas meant for me to have it, maybe so, but Thomas also left you to face the consequences of his actions." Kieran's voice hardened. "I won't do the same. That package stays hidden until I'm certain it won't bring Wade's men down on us more than they already are." Nora wanted to argue further, but the logic of his position was undeniable. Instead, she asked, "Did Thomas say anything else? About what he'd done, what he'd taken?" Kieran shook his head. "Only that it was valuable and that Wade would kill to get it back." He glanced at her. "Did he tell you anything that night you argued?" Nora closed her eyes, remembering that last terrible conversation. He was drinking, which was unusual. He said he'd made a mistake, gotten involved with dangerous men, said he'd taken something that would set us up for life, but that we needed to leave immediately. She opened her eyes, meeting Kieran's gaze. I refused. I told him I was tired of running, tired of his schemes. I said if he'd done something wrong, he needed to make it right. And then, he left, stormed out, said I didn't understand what was at stake. Nora's voice caught. That was the last time I saw him alive. Kieran was silent for a long moment. You couldn't have known what would happen. Couldn't I? Nora's laugh was bitter. Deep down, I always knew there was something wrong, something he wasn't telling me. I just didn't want to see it. We all have blind spots when it comes to people we care for, Kieran said quietly. The simple statement, free of judgment, loosened something in Nora's chest. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the crushing weight of guilt ease slightly. They traveled until midday, stopping in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and dried apples. Kieran remained vigilant, his rifle close at hand, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. You think they're following us? Nora asked as they prepared to continue their journey. Not yet, Kieran replied, but they will be once they realize we've left town. He helped her back onto the wagon seat. We've got a head start and they won't know which way we've gone. That buys us time. As they traveled through the afternoon, the landscape began to change, the rolling prairie giving way to more broken country rocky outcroppings, deeper ravines, stands of pine and aspen growing more frequent. Kieran kept them moving at a steady pace, alternating between trotting and walking the horses to conserve their strength. Nora found herself studying him as he drove, the strong profile, the watchful eyes, the capable hands on the reins. Despite the circumstances, she felt oddly secure in his presence. There was a steadiness to Kieran Ironwood that Thomas had never possessed, a quiet competence that required no bluster or charm to reinforce it. You're staring, Mrs. Linden, Kieran said without looking at her. Nora flushed. I was just thinking how different you are from my husband. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. Nora smoothed her skirts. May I ask you something personal, Mr. Ironwood? You can ask. Have you ever been married? The question seemed to surprise him. No. Never found the right woman. A shadow crossed his face. Found her, lost her. Nora waited, but he offered nothing more. I'm sorry, she said finally. Kieran nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy but clearly unwilling to elaborate. They rode in silence for another hour before he spoke again. There was a girl back in Pennsylvania, Hannah. We were to be married after the war. His voice was matter of fact, but Nora could hear the carefully controlled emotion beneath it. She took ill while I was away, died before I could get home. That's terrible, Nora said softly. How long ago? 12 years, give or take. Kieran's eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead. Long time ago now, but not long enough, Nora thought, recognizing the familiar ghost of grief that haunted his words. She knew better than to offer platitudes. Instead, she asked, Is that why you came west? Partly. Nothing left for me back east. He glanced at her. What about you? Any family besides your husband, a sister in Boston? We haven't spoken in some time. Nora looked down at her hands. She didn't approve of Thomas, thought I was making a mistake. Smart woman, your sister. Despite everything, Nora laughed. Yes, Catherine always was the sensible one. I was the dreamer, always wanting adventure, romance. Her smile faded. I certainly got more than I bargained for. As the afternoon waned, Kieran guided the wagon into increasingly rugged terrain, following what seemed to Nora to be no trail at all. Are you sure we're heading the right way? She asked as they navigated a narrow passage between two rocky hillsides. Trust me, was all he said. Just before sunset, they emerged into a small, hidden valley where a creek bubbled between stands of cottonwood trees. Kieran drew the wagon to a halt in a protected area where the trees grew thickest. We'll camp here tonight, he said, jumping down from the seat. Good water, good cover. As Kieran unhitched the horses and tended to them, Nora gathered wood for a small fire. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from her thoughts, which had been circling all day between fear, grief, and confusion about the man who was now her only ally. By the time darkness fell, they had a camp established, a small fire, bedrolls laid out on opposite sides of it, and a simple stew bubbling in a pot. Nora sat wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance while Kieran cleaned his rifle with methodical care. "Mr. Ironwood," she said after they'd eaten in companionable silence, "I realize I haven't properly thanked you for what you're doing." He looked up from his work. "No need." "There is," Nora insisted. "You didn't have to come with me. You could have just warned me about Wade's men and let me fend for myself. Most people would have." Kieran set the rifle aside. "I'm not most people, clearly." Nora studied him across the fire, his features thrown into sharp relief by the flickering light. "But I still don't understand why." "Why risk yourself for me?" For a long moment, Kieran was silent, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "When I came back from the war, I wasn't the same man who left. I'd seen things, done things. It changes you." He looked up at her. "I drifted for years, not caring much what happened to me or anyone else. Then one day, outside of Denver, I came across a stage robbery, 3 men attacking a coach, passengers screaming." "What did you do?" Nora asked when he paused. "Nothing," Kieran said flatly. "I rode on by. Told myself it wasn't my problem." The self-loathing in his voice was palpable. "Next town I came to, I learned a woman and her child had been killed in that robbery." "Oh, Kieran," Nora breathed, forgetting formality in the face of his pain. "I swore that day I'd never again turn my back when someone needed help." He met her eyes across the fire. "So when I saw Wade's men in town, asking after you, I couldn't just let you go off alone." The raw honesty of his confession left Nora speechless. She'd expected many possible motives: chivalry, attraction, even some hidden agenda related to Thomas's package, but not this deeply personal redemption. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, "and for being the kind of man who keeps that promise." Kieran nodded once, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He stood, brushing off his pants. "We should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." As they settled into their bedrolls, the fire burning low between them, Nora found herself watching Kieran's profile against the starlit sky. He was a man shaped by loss and regret, much like herself. Perhaps that was why, despite the danger surrounding them, she felt a growing trust in him that she hadn't felt in anyone since before Thomas's betrayal. "Good night, Mr. Ironwood," she said softly. "Kieran," he corrected, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "Out here seems foolish to stand on ceremony." "Kieran," Nora repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Nora." "Good night, Nora," he said. And though she couldn't see his face clearly, she thought she heard a smile in his voice. As she drifted toward sleep, Nora realized that for the first time in months, the crushing weight of shame and fear had lifted slightly. Tomorrow would bring its own dangers, but tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, she wasn't alone. Dawn broke clear and cold, with frost silvering the grass around their camp. Nora woke to find Kieran already up, tending the horses and rebuilding the fire. He'd prepared coffee in a battered tin pot, and the rich aroma filled the small clearing. "You sleep well?" he asked, handing her a cup. Nora accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. "Better than I expected." She sipped the strong brew, grimacing slightly at the bitterness. "You? Well enough." Kieran nodded toward the eastern horizon, where the sun was just beginning to crest the distant hills. "We should move soon. Want to make the crossing at Powder River before midday." They broke camp efficiently, Nora following Kieran's lead in erasing signs of their presence. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were on the trail again, the wagon creaking softly as it navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. "Tell me about your brother's ranch," Nora said as they traveled. The silence of the open country, broken only by the horses' steady footfalls and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead, felt oppressive after the relative bustle of Tumbleweed Creek. "What's it like?" Kieran's expression softened slightly. "Beautiful country, high valley nestled against the Bighorns, with good water and shelter from the winter storms. Nathan runs about 300 head of cattle, keeps some horses too." A faint smile touched his lips. "His wife, Sarah, has turned the place into a real home. Garden, chickens, even curtains in the windows. How long since you've seen them? Going on 2 years now. A shadow crossed his face. Like I said, we had differences. About what, if you don't mind my asking? Kieran was silent for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "After Hannah died, I wasn't fit company for anyone. Drank too much, fought too much. Nathan and Sarah took me in after the war, tried to help me find my footing again." He sighed. "I repaid them by being the worst kind of house guest. Eventually, Nathan had enough, told me to either straighten up or move on. I moved on." "And now you're bringing a fugitive widow to his doorstep," Nora observed wryly. "I'm sure that will smooth things over." Unexpectedly, Kieran laughed, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his face. "When you put it that way, maybe we should reconsider our plan." Nora smiled, pleased to have broken through his usual reserve. "I'm sorry to be the cause of further strain between you." "You're not," Kieran assured her. "Nathan's a good man, he'll understand once I explain." "About Wade's men, or about Thomas's package?" Kieran's expression grew serious again. "Both. Nathan has a right to know what we're bringing to his door." They fell silent as the wagon crested a rise, revealing a broad valley cut by a winding ribbon of water, the Powder River. Kieran explained. They'd need to ford it at a shallow point downstream, then continue northwest toward the mountains that now dominated the horizon. As they descended toward the river, Nora found herself watching Kieran again. Despite the gravity of their situation, there was something comforting about his steady presence, his quiet competence. With Thomas, she'd always felt slightly off balance, always trying to keep up with his schemes and dreams. With Kieran, there was a refreshing solidity, a sense that his word, once given, was immovable. "You're staring again, Mrs. Linden," Kieran said, his eyes still on the trail ahead. "Nora," she corrected. "And I was just thinking that you're a rare sort of man, Kieran Ironwood." He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised in question. "The kind who does what needs doing without fanfare," she explained. "Thomas was all talk, always making grand plans and promises. But you simply act." A faint flush colored Kieran's weathered cheeks. "Don't go making me into something I'm not," he warned. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my time. We all have," Nora replied softly. "The measure of a person is how they face those mistakes." Kieran looked at her sharply, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Nathan used to say something similar." Nora smiled. "Then he sounds like a wise man. I look forward to meeting him." They reached the river around mid-morning. The Powder was running high with spring melt, but Kieran found a crossing point where the water looked to be no more than 3 feet deep. Still, the current was swift, the water ice cold from the mountain snowpack. "It'll be a rough crossing," he warned, studying the river with narrowed eyes. "The horses will need to work hard and will likely get wet." Nora nodded, tightening her shawl around her shoulders. "I'm ready." Kieran gave her an appraising look, then nodded once, apparently satisfied with her resolve. He urged the horses forward, guiding them carefully into the rushing water. The wagon lurched as it entered the river, the current immediately pushing against its wheels. Nora gripped the seat tightly as cold water sprayed up around them. The horses strained against their harnesses, muscles bunching as they fought the current. "Good girls," Kieran encouraged them, his voice calm but firm. "Steady now." They were halfway across when disaster struck. A submerged log, hidden by the churning water, caught against the wagon's right wheel. The vehicle lurched violently, nearly tipping over. Nora cried out as she was thrown against the side rail. "Hold on," Kieran shouted, fighting to control the panicking horses. The wagon tilted precariously, water now pouring over the side and soaking their supplies. With a tremendous crack, the wheels struck by the log gave way, splintering apart. "We're going over." Kieran flung the reins aside and reached for Nora, wrapping a strong arm around her waist. "Jump." They plunged into the frigid river together just as the wagon overturned completely. The shock of the cold water drove the breath from Nora's lungs. She flailed wildly, her sodden skirts dragging her down, but Kieran's grip remained firm. "Kick," he ordered, his face inches from hers as they struggled in the current. "Work with me." Together, they fought their way toward the far bank, the current carrying them downstream from where the wagon now lay on its side, half submerged. The horses, freed from their harnesses by the impact, had already made it to shore and stood dripping and snorting with alarm. When Nora's feet finally touched bottom, she nearly wept with relief. Kieran half dragged her the last few yards to shore, where they collapsed on the rocky bank, gasping for breath. "Are you hurt?" Kieran demanded, his hands moving quickly over her arms and shoulders, checking for injuries. "No," Nora managed through chattering teeth. "Just cold." Kieran nodded, his own lips blue with cold. "We need to get dry, get warm." He looked back at the river, where their wagon and supplies were visible only as a dark shape in the rushing water. "Damn, lost everything." "Not everything," Nora pointed out, nodding toward the horses who stood nearby, still breathing hard but otherwise unharmed. Kieran followed her gaze, then let out a short laugh that was more relief than humor. "You're right," he squeezed her shoulder. "Wait here. I'll see if I can salvage anything from the wagon." Despite her protests, Kieran waded back into the frigid water, making his way carefully to the overturned wagon. Nora watched anxiously as he disappeared beneath the surface several times, emerging each time with something clutched in his hands, his rifle, a small pack, and finally, a tightly wrapped oilskin package that he secured inside his sodden jacket. By the time he returned to shore, Nora was shivering uncontrollably, her wet clothes like ice against her skin. Kieran didn't look much better, his face pale beneath his tan. "We need shelter," he said, teeth chattering. "There's a line of trees about half a mile north. Think you can make it?" Nora nodded, determined not to be a burden despite her exhaustion and the bone-deep cold. Kieran caught one of the horses, the steadier of the two. He explained and helped Nora mount. Without a saddle, she had to ride astride, her sodden skirts hitched up immodestly around her knees. In other circumstances, she might have been mortified, but survival trumped propriety. Kieran led the horse on foot, capturing the second horse along the way. They made slow progress toward the trees, both humans and animals shivering in the cool spring air. Nora focused on staying upright, on not giving in to the exhaustion that tugged at her with each passing minute. The trees, when they reached them, proved to be a decent-sized stand of cottonwoods and pines, offering shelter from the wind. Kieran found a small clearing and helped Nora dismount, her legs nearly buckling as she slid to the ground. "I need to start a fire," he said, his voice rough with cold. "But first, you need to get out of those wet clothes." Nora stared at him, suddenly acutely aware of their situation alone in the wilderness, no dry clothing, no supplies beyond what Kieran had salvaged. Seeing her expression, Kieran shook his head. "I'm not suggesting. Look, I'll turn my back, wrap yourself in this." He handed her the oilskin he'd retrieved from the wagon. "It's mostly dry inside. You can use it as a blanket while I get a fire going. If we don't get warm soon, we're in serious trouble." The practical logic of his words overcame Nora's instinctive modesty. She nodded, taking the oilskin package. "What about you?" "I'll manage," Kieran said grimly. "Been wet and cold before." He turned his back and moved several yards away, beginning to gather wood for a fire. Nora's fingers were nearly numb as she struggled with the buttons of her dress. Finally, she managed to remove her sodden outer garments, hanging them over a low branch. Her chemise and drawers were also wet, but she couldn't bring herself to remove them, compromise or no. She unwrapped the oilskin package, revealing a bundle of papers secured with twine, which she set carefully aside. The oilskin itself was large enough to wrap around her like a blanket, which she did gratefully, sinking down onto a relatively dry patch of ground beneath a pine tree. "Decent." Kieran called without turning. "Yes," Nora replied, though she felt anything but. Kieran returned with an armload of wood and kindling, which he arranged with efficient movements. From the small pack he'd salvaged, he produced a tinderbox that had somehow stayed dry. Within minutes, he had a small flame going, nursing it carefully until it caught the larger pieces of wood. Only when the fire was burning steadily did Kieran turn his attention to his own wet clothing. He removed his jacket and shirt, hanging them near the fire to dry. Nora tried not to stare at his bare torso, but found her eyes drawn to the network of scars that crisscrossed his chest and back, some clearly from the war, others with less obvious origins. Kieran caught her looking and gave a rueful smile. "Not a pretty sight, I know." "No, Nora flushed. "I was just thinking you've survived a great deal." "So have you," he replied simply, settling on the opposite side of the fire. He was shivering still, but made no move to claim part of the oilskin or move closer to her. They sat in silence for a time, the fire slowly bringing warmth back to their bodies. Finally, Nora nodded toward the bundle of papers she'd set aside. "Is that it? Thomas's package?" Kieran followed her gaze, then nodded. "Seems so. Aren't you curious what's inside? What was worth killing for?" "Of course," he met her eyes across the fire. "But it's not my secret to uncover. It's yours when you're ready." The simple statement, the respect it implied for her agency despite everything, warmed Nora more than the fire. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. Most men wouldn't have." "That is, being alone like this." "I told you before," Kieran interrupted gently. "I'm not most men." "No," Nora agreed. "You're not." She hesitated, then made a decision. "I think I'm ready to see what's in that package." Kieran studied her face for a moment, then nodded. He retrieved the bundle and handed it to her, his expression grave. "Whatever's in there, remember Thomas's choices were his own, not yours." Nora's hands trembled slightly as she untied the twine binding the papers. Inside was a leather portfolio containing several documents, deeds, by the look of them, along with a folded letter addressed to her in Thomas's flowing script. She opened the letter first, steeling herself for whatever final words her husband had left her. "My dearest Nora," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have failed in my promise to give us a better life. I have done terrible things, made terrible choices, and now they have caught up with me. But know that everything I did for us for the future I wanted to give you." Nora paused, fighting back tears. Even now, Thomas was justifying himself, casting his crimes as acts of love. The letter continued, explaining how Thomas had become involved with Harlan Wade, initially as a legitimate business partner in a mining venture. But Wade was corrupt, using the mining operation to launder money from other, darker enterprises. When Thomas discovered this, rather than going to the authorities, he saw an opportunity. He stole the deeds to several valuable mining claims that Wade had acquired through intimidation and fraud, along with ledgers documenting Wade's criminal activities. "These deeds are legally questionable," Thomas wrote, "but with the right lawyer they could be validated. The property they represent is worth a fortune, Nora, enough to set you up for life, far from here, far from Wade. The ledgers are your insurance. Wade can't come after you openly without risking exposure." The letter ended with apologies and declarations of love that rang hollow to Nora's ears. She set it aside and examined the deeds, 5 in total, for mining claims in Colorado and Nevada, each potentially worth thousands if legitimate. "He stole mining deeds," she said finally, looking up at Kieran. "And evidence of Wade's crimes. He thought I could use them to blackmail Wade, essentially, to buy my safety." Kieran's expression was grim. "Your husband didn't understand men like Wade. They don't negotiate, they eliminate problems. So these are worthless." Nora gestured to the papers in her lap. "Not worthless, dangerous." Kieran rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "The deeds themselves might be valuable to the right buyer if they can be proven legitimate, but more importantly, those ledgers are evidence that could put Wade away for a long time." "What should I do with them?" Kieran considered for a moment. "For now, keep them safe. Once we reach Nathan's ranch, we can decide on next steps, maybe contact the federal marshal in Cheyenne." Nora rewrapped the documents, her mind reeling. Thomas had left her not a fortune, as he'd intended, but a deadly problem with no easy solution. Why would he do this? She asked, more to herself than to Kieran. Why not simply go to the law when he discovered Wade's crimes? "Some men see opportunity where others see duty," Kieran replied. Thomas saw a chance for wealth rather than justice. The simple truth of this assessment struck Nora like a physical blow. Thomas had never been the man she thought. She'd married the charming, ambitious husband with dreams of building a life together. He'd been an opportunist, willing to risk not only his life but hers for a chance at easy money. "I was such a fool," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I believed everything he told me, left my teaching position, my friends, my family, all for a lie." Kieran moved then, coming to sit beside her. Hesitantly, he placed an arm around her shoulders. "You weren't a fool, Nora, you were trusting. There's a difference." Nora leaned into his solid warmth, too exhausted and emotionally drained to maintain proper distance. "How do I fix this?" she asked. "How do I make this right?" "One step at a time," Kieran said, his voice steady and reassuring in her ear. "First, we get to Nathan's. Then we figure out how to deal with Wade, together." The simple promise together eased something in Nora's chest. She'd been alone since Thomas's death, carrying the weight of suspicion and fear by herself. Now, somehow, she had an ally. More than that, she had someone she was beginning to trust in a way she'd never trusted Thomas. As the day waned, their clothes gradually dried by the fire. Kieran fashioned a rough shelter of pine boughs to protect them from the elements, and they shared the meager provisions he'd managed to salvage from the wagon jerky, a few pieces of hardtack, and a canteen of water. "We'll have to ride double tomorrow," Kieran explained as they prepared to sleep. "Without a saddle, it'll be uncomfortable, but the horses can manage until we reach Nathan's." Nora nodded, trying not to think about the intimacy that riding double would entail. How much further? With the wagon, it would have been 2 more days. "On horseback, pushing hard, we might make it by tomorrow evening." Kieran arranged his now dry jacket as a makeshift pillow. "Try to get some sleep. Dawn comes early." They settled on opposite sides of the fire, the documents safely tucked into Kieran's pack between them. Despite her exhaustion, Nora found sleep elusive. The day's events kept replaying in her mind: the river crossing, the accident, the revelations in Thomas's letter. And beneath it all, the growing awareness of Kieran Ironwood not just as her protector, but as a man. She watched him across the dying fire, his features relaxed in sleep, looking younger and less careworn. What would it be like, she wondered, to be cared for by a man like that? A man whose promises weren't hollow, whose strength wasn't a performance put on to impress. Nora turned away, chiding herself for such thoughts. Kieran was helping her out of a sense of duty and decency, nothing more. And she was still a widow whose husband wasn't yet cold in his grave, a widow with dangerous enemies and an uncertain future. Still, as she finally drifted toward sleep, Nora couldn't help but feel a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Morning brought clear skies and warmer temperatures, for which Nora was profoundly grateful. Her clothes, though dry, were wrinkled and stained from their river adventure, her hair a tangled mess she could do little about without a proper brush. But such concerns seemed trivial given their circumstances. Kieran was already up when she woke, tending to the horses and preparing a small breakfast from their limited supplies. He'd shaved with a pocket knife, she noted, though his efforts had left a few nicks along his jaw. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing her a piece of jerky and some water. "Well enough," Nora replied, accepting the sparse meal with gratitude. "And you?" Kieran shrugged. "Been better, been worse." He nodded toward the horses. "We should get moving soon. Wade's men will be on our trail by now." The reminder of the danger still pursuing them sobered Nora immediately. She ate quickly, then helped Kieran break down their makeshift camp, erasing signs of their presence as best they could. Riding double proved to be exactly as awkward as Nora had anticipated. Without a proper saddle, Kieran fashioned a blanket into a pad on the larger horse's back. He mounted first, then reached down to help Nora up behind him. "Hold on to my waist," he instructed as she settled behind him, trying to maintain some semblance of propriety despite the intimate position. "It'll be a rough ride." Nora gingerly placed her hands on either side of his waist, hyper-aware of the solid muscle beneath her fingers. Kieran clicked to the horse, and they set off at a brisk trot, the second horse following on a lead rope. The motion of the horse forced Nora to hold tighter than she'd intended, her body pressed against Kieran's back with each stride. After an hour, she'd given up any pretense of maintaining distance, simply holding on as they navigated the increasingly mountainous terrain. They spoke little as they traveled, both aware of the need to make good time. The landscape grew more dramatic as they approached the Bighorn Mountains' towering pines, rocky outcroppings, and deep ravines that required careful navigation. By midday, they were traveling along a narrow trail that wound its way up into the foothills, the air growing cooler and crisper with the elevation. "How much further?" Nora asked during a brief stop to rest the horses at a small mountain stream. "A few hours," Kieran replied, scanning the trail behind them with narrowed eyes. "Nathan's place is in a high valley just beyond that ridge." He pointed to a distant line of mountains, still partially obscured by the trees surrounding them. "You think they're still following us?" Nora couldn't help glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Wade's men emerging from the forest. "Hard to say. The river crossing might have thrown them off our trail, at least temporarily." Kieran helped her remount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "But men like that don't give up easily." They continued on, the trail gradually widening as it wound through a series of high meadows carpeted with early spring wildflowers. Under different circumstances, Nora would have found the scenery breathtaking. Now she registered it only peripherally, her attention divided between the solid warmth of Kieran's back against her chest and the constant vigilance for signs of pursuit. Late afternoon found them cresting a final ridge, revealing a verdant valley nestled between protective mountain arms. A small ranch spread across the valley floor, a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, several outbuildings, corrals with horses and cattle visible even at this distance. "Nathan's place," Kieran said, a note of something like longing in his voice. "It's beautiful," Nora breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Kieran nodded, urging their tired horse forward. "Come on, we're almost there." They were halfway down the slope toward the ranch when a rifle shot cracked through the air. Their horse reared in alarm, nearly unseating them both. "Hold on," Kieran shouted, fighting to control the frightened animal. Once the horse had steadied, he called out, "Nathan, it's Kieran, don't shoot, brother." A moment of tense silence followed, then a voice called back from a stand of trees near the trail. "Kieran, that really you?" "It's me," Kieran confirmed. "I've brought a friend, we need help." A man emerged from the trees, rifle still held ready but no longer aimed directly at them. He was similar to Kieran in build, though his hair was lighter and his face less weathered. His expression was a complex mixture of surprise, wariness, and what might have been relief. "2 years without a word," Nathan Ironwood said as he approached, "and you show up unannounced with a woman riding double. You always did know how to make an entrance, little brother." Despite the gravity of their situation, Nora felt Kieran's chest rumble with a suppressed laugh. "Good to see you too, Nathan." Nathan's gaze shifted to Nora, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "Nathan Ironwood." "I'd say welcome to my home, but I'm still waiting to hear why you're here." "Nathan, this is Mrs. Nora Linden," Kieran said. "She's in trouble, we both are. I'll explain everything, but first we need to get inside. There might be men following us." Nathan's expression sharpened. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that gets people killed," Kieran replied bluntly. "Please, Nathan, for old time's sake." The brothers locked eyes for a long moment, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Nathan nodded. "All right, but I want the full story once you're settled." He glanced toward the ranch house. "Sarah's going to have questions too." "I'd expect nothing less," Kieran said, relief evident in his voice. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch together, Nathan leading the way with his rifle still at the ready. As they approached the cabin, a woman emerged onto the porch, tall and slender, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun. She shaded her eyes against the setting sun, then let out a small cry of surprise. "Kieran, is that you?" "It's me, Sarah," Kieran called, dismounting and then helping Nora down from the horse. "Sorry to drop in unannounced." Sarah hurried down the porch steps, her expression a mixture of joy and confusion. She embraced Kieran briefly, then stepped back to look at Nora. "And who might this be?" "Mrs. Nora Linden," Kieran introduced her. "Nora, this is my sister-in-law, Sarah Ironwood." "Mrs. Linden," Sarah said, her quick eyes taking in Nora's bedraggled state. "You look like you've had quite a journey." That's putting it mildly, Nora replied with a weary smile. And please call me Nora, Sarah nodded, then turned to her husband. Nathan, take their horses to the barn. I'll get our guests settled inside. Her tone was warm but brooked no argument. Nathan complied with a nod, leading the tired animals away after a final questioning look at his brother. Come inside, Sarah said, ushering them toward the cabin. You both look half-starved and dead on your feet. We can talk after you've had a hot meal and a chance to clean up. The interior of the cabin was exactly as Kieran had described, cozy and homelike, with curtains at the windows and a cheerful fire in the hearth. Delicious smells wafted from a pot hanging over the fire, making Nora's stomach growl embarrassingly. I've got stew on, Sarah said, noting Nora's reaction with a smile. But first, let's get you some clean clothes and hot water for washing. You've had a rough time of it, by the look of things. Within an hour, Nora found herself transformed. Sarah, though taller, had provided a clean dress that fit well enough with some quick adjustments. A basin of hot water, soap, and a proper brush had allowed Nora to clean herself and tame her tangled hair. By the time she emerged from the small side room where Sarah had led her, she felt almost human again. Kieran, too, had cleaned up, his hair still damp from washing, wearing clothes that must have belonged to Nathan. He looked up as Nora entered the main room, his eyes widening slightly. You look. He began, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. You look rested, he finished, somewhat lamely. Nora felt her cheeks warm at his obvious appreciation, brief though it was. Thank you, I feel much better. Nathan had returned from the barn and now sat at the large wooden table that dominated one end of the room. Now, he said as Sarah began ladling stew into bowls, suppose you tell us what kind of trouble brings you to our door after all this time, Kieran. Over the simple but delicious meal, Kieran and Nora took turns explaining the situation: Thomas's death, the mysterious package, Wade's men, and their flight from Tumbleweed Creek. Nora found herself watching Nathan and Sarah's reactions carefully, fearing to see judgment or rejection, but their expressions remained thoughtful and concerned. So these men, these associates of Wade's, Nathan said when they'd finished, you think they're still tracking you? Kieran nodded grimly. Wade isn't the type to let something go, especially not evidence that could put him behind bars. And you're certain they followed you from Tumbleweed Creek? Sarah asked, her brow furrowed with worry. Not certain, Kieran admitted. The river crossing might have thrown them off our trail, but I wouldn't count on it. Nathan exchanged a look with his wife, some silent communication passing between them. You can stay as long as you need, he said finally, but we need to be prepared if these men do track you here. I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door, Nora said, guilt weighing heavily on her. If there had been any other way. Nonsense, Sarah interrupted firmly. Your family, Kieran, and any friend of yours is welcome here. She reached across the table to squeeze Nora's hand. We'll face this together. The simple acceptance, the inclusion in their family circle brought unexpected tears to Nora's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Later, after the meal was cleared away and plans had been discussed for securing the ranch against possible intruders, Sarah showed Nora to a small bedroom off the main living area. It's not much, she apologized, but it's clean and the bed is comfortable. It's perfect, Nora assured her, taking in the simple room with its patchwork quilt and curtained window. I can't thank you enough for your hospitality. Sarah smiled, lingering in the doorway. Kieran's a good man, she said unexpectedly, better than he gives himself credit for. Nora looked up, startled by the comment. Yes, I'm beginning to see that. He's been through a lot, Sarah continued. The war changed him like it did so many men, and then losing Hannah. She shook her head, but the Kieran I remember is still in there. I see glimpses of him when he looks at you. Before Nora could form a response to this surprising observation, Sarah bid her good night and closed the door softly, leaving Nora alone with her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the soft quilt. So much had happened in the past few days, her life upended, her future uncertain, and yet somehow she'd found herself here, surrounded by good people willing to risk themselves for her safety, and then there was Kieran. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. I see glimpses of him when he looks at you. Was it possible that he felt the same strange connection that had been growing within her? The same tentative trust that was slowly blossoming into something more? Nora shook her head, chiding herself for such thoughts. Kieran had been kind, yes, protective and honorable. But that didn't mean he saw her as anything more than a responsibility, a promise to be kept still. As she prepared for bed in the small, cozy room, Nora couldn't help but remember the look in his eyes when she'd emerged in Sarah's dress, clean and composed once more. There had been appreciation there, certainly, but something else too, something that made her heart beat a little faster when she recalled it. Exhaustion soon overcame her tumbling thoughts, and Nora fell into the deepest sleep she'd had since Thomas's death, safe for the first time in what felt like forever. The next few days at the Ironwood Ranch fell into a rhythm that was both comforting and surreal to Nora. During the days, she helped Sarah with household tasks, cooking, cleaning, tending the small kitchen garden while the brothers worked on fortifying the ranch against possible attack. They repaired fences, reinforced doors and shutters, and took turns keeping watch from strategic points around the property. In the evenings, they gathered around the table or the hearth, sharing meals and conversation that gradually grew more relaxed as the initial tension between the brothers eased. Nora learned more about the Ironwoods' upbringing in Pennsylvania, their father's death when they were young, and their mother's determination to keep the family together despite hardship. She was a remarkable woman, Sarah said one evening as they sat mending by lamplight. Taught both boys to read and write, to cipher, to think for themselves. She'd have liked you, I think. Nora looked up from her sewing. Why do you say that? You've got the same kind of strength, Sarah replied simply. The quiet kind that doesn't make a fuss but gets things done. Nora flushed at the unexpected compliment. I don't feel very strong most of the time. Strength isn't about feeling, Sarah said wisely. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared half to death. She glanced toward the window, where Kieran stood watch in the gathering darkness. He sees it in you too, you know. Nora followed her gaze, watching Kieran's silhouette against the twilight sky. Over the past days, she'd caught him looking at her often, his expression thoughtful and sometimes troubled. They hadn't spoken privately since arriving at the ranch, both seemingly content to let the immediate danger take precedence over the growing connection between them. I don't know what he sees in me, Nora admitted softly. A widow with a deadly secret and dangerous enemies isn't exactly a catch, Sarah laughed gently. Love doesn't calculate worth the way a shopkeeper tallies goods, Nora. Love, Nora nearly pricked her finger in surprise. I never said you didn't have to, Sarah interrupted with a knowing smile. I have eyes. Before Nora could formulate a response, the door opened and Nathan entered, stamping dust from his boots. All quiet, he reported, no sign of anyone for miles. Perhaps they lost our trail after all, Nora suggested hopefully. Nathan's expression remained skeptical. Perhaps, but we'll keep watch all the same. As the days passed without incident, Nora began to wonder if perhaps Wade's men had indeed lost their trail or worse, found another target for their vengeance. The thought that some innocent might suffer in her place was troubling, but the alternative that the danger still loomed, invisible but approaching, was equally disturbing. On the fourth evening of their stay, Nora found herself unable to sleep despite the comfortable bed and the security of the ranch house. After tossing and turning for what felt like hours, she rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and slipped quietly into the main room. The fire had burned low, casting the room in soft, flickering shadows. To her surprise, Kieran sat beside it, cleaning his rifle with methodical movements. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Nora shook her head, moving to sit in a chair opposite him. Too many thoughts, Kieran nodded, returning to his task. Nathan thinks we should take the evidence to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, he said after a moment. Says it's the only way to be truly free of Wade. And what do you think? Kieran was silent for a long moment, his hands still moving over the rifle. I think he's right, he finally said, but it's dangerous. Wade has connections, even in law enforcement. We'd need to be careful about who we trust. We, Nora repeated softly. You keep saying we, as if my problems are yours. Kieran looked up then, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight. Aren't they? At this point, the simple question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Nora found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze. Kieran, she began, then faltered, unsure what she wanted to say. That she was grateful, that she was confused by the feelings growing within her, that she was afraid not just of Wade's men, but of trusting her heart again so soon after Thomas's betrayal. Before she could find the words, a sound from outside caught their attention, the soft nicker of a horse, quickly hushed. Kieran was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Wake Nathan, he whispered urgently, then stay inside, away from the windows. Nora hurried to obey, heart pounding as she roused Nathan and Sarah from sleep. Within moments, Nathan was armed and moving to join his brother at the front of the house, while Sarah calmly but efficiently gathered essentials into a small pack. Back way out if needed, she explained to Nora, handing her a small pistol. Do you know how to use this? Nora nodded. Her father had taught her the basics before he left for the war. I hope it won't come to that. As do I, Sarah agreed grimly, but hope isn't a strategy. Outside, the night had gone eerily silent, no cricket chirps, no rustle of nocturnal creatures. The artificial stillness raised the hair on Nora's arms. They were being watched, surrounded perhaps by men who had tracked them across 100 miles of wilderness with deadly purpose. A voice called from the darkness, making them all jump. Ironwood, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and the package, and this doesn't have to get messy. Nathan and Kieran exchanged glances. Wade's men, Kieran confirmed quietly. I count at least 3 voices, probably more. What do we do? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear visible in her eyes. We don't give them what they want, Nathan said firmly. That's for certain. Kieran nodded, then turned to Nora. The package, where is it? In my room, she whispered, under the mattress. Get it, he instructed, and your shawl, be ready to move. As Nora hurried to retrieve Thomas's package, she heard Kieran call back to the men outside. Nobody here by that name, you've got the wrong ranch, a harsh laugh answered him. Don't play games, Ironwood. We tracked you from the river crossing. We know the widow Linden is with you, and we know what she's carrying. Our employer wants it back. Your employer is a criminal, Kieran shouted, and we've already sent the evidence to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. This bluff was met with a moment of silence then. You're lying, but it doesn't matter. Our orders are to retrieve the package, and the widow, dead or alive, doesn't much matter to Mr. Wade. Nora returned with the package clutched to her chest, her shawl thrown hastily around her shoulders. Kieran took the package and tucked it inside his shirt, then grasped her shoulders. Listen to me, he said urgently. There's a root cellar accessible from the pantry, hidden. Sarah will show you. I want you to go there and stay hidden no matter what you hear. Understand? What about you? Nora protested. I won't hide while you risk your lives for me. This isn't a debate, Kieran said firmly. Sarah, take her now. Sarah grasped Nora's arm, pulling her toward the back of the house. Come on, he's right, it's our best chance. Reluctantly, Nora allowed herself to be led to the pantry, where Sarah moved aside a barrel to reveal a trapdoor in the floor. Down you go, she whispered. Stay quiet, we'll come for you when it's safe. Sarah, wait, Nora began, but the other woman was already closing the trapdoor, plunging Nora into darkness. The root cellar was small and damp, smelling of earth and preserved vegetables. Nora crouched in the darkness, straining to hear what was happening above. Muffled voices, the sound of furniture being moved, then a sudden, sharp crack that could only be a gunshot. Nora bit her lip to keep from crying out, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails cut into her palms. More gunshots followed, along with shouting and the crash of breaking glass. The sounds of violence seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only minutes. Then, terrifyingly, silence fell. Nora waited, heart pounding, for some sign of who had prevailed. Had the Ironwoods repelled the attack, or had Wade's men succeeded and even now were searching the house for her? Heavy footsteps moved across the floor above her head, pausing here and there as if searching. Nora held her breath, the small pistol clutched in her trembling hand. The footsteps drew nearer to the pantry, then stopped directly overhead. The trapdoor creaked, then lifted. Nora raised the pistol, finger on the trigger, ready to fire at whoever appeared. "Nora," Kieran's voice strained but unmistakable. "It's me. It's safe to come out now." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that for a moment she couldn't move or speak. Then she was scrambling up the ladder, emerging into the pantry where Kieran waited, his face streaked with soot and what looked like blood. "You're hurt," she cried, reaching for him instinctively. "It's not mine," he assured her quickly. "Are you all right?" Nora nodded, still clutching the pistol. "What happened? I heard shooting." "They tried to rush the house. Bad move." Kieran's expression was grim. "Nathan and I were ready for them. 2 are dead, 1 wounded, the others ran." "Nathan, Sarah, are they?" "They're fine," Kieran assured her. "Nathan took a graze to the arm, nothing serious. Sarah's tending to him now." Nora sagged against him in relief, and Kieran's arms came around her automatically, holding her steady. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the pantry doorway, clinging to each other in the aftermath of violence. "I was so afraid," Nora whispered against his chest, "when I heard the shots." Kieran's hand moved to the back of her head, cradling it gently. "It's over now, you're safe." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Nora could feel the tension in his body, the alertness that hadn't subsided. "It's not over, is it?" she asked, pulling back slightly to look up at his face. "The others who escaped, they'll come back with more men." Kieran's silence was answer enough. "We need to move quickly," he said finally. "Get to Cheyenne before Wade can muster more force against us. Nathan's already saddling the horses." The next hour passed in a blur of activity as they prepared to leave. The wounded man, secured in the barn under Sarah's watchful eye, revealed under questioning that Wade himself was in Denver, but had sent 6 men to retrieve the package and Nora. 3 had escaped and would almost certainly return with reinforcements. "We have a day, maybe 2, Nathan estimated as they gathered outside in the pre-dawn light. 4 horses stood ready, saddled and provisioned for a hard ride. "You're not coming with us," Kieran protested when he saw the 4th horse. "This isn't your fight, Nathan." "Like hell it isn't," his brother replied calmly. "Those men attacked my home, endangered my wife. Besides," he added with a glint in his eye, "someone has to make sure you don't do anything foolish." Kieran opened his mouth to argue further, but Sarah interrupted. "It's decided, Kieran. Nathan goes with you, I'll stay here with our guest." She nodded toward the barn where the wounded man was secured. "Make sure he doesn't cause trouble while you're gone." The brothers exchanged a long look, years of shared history and unspoken understanding passing between them. Finally, Kieran nodded. "All right, but at the first sign of more trouble you get to the Wilsons' place down the valley, promise me, Sarah." "I promise," she agreed, then embraced him fiercely. "Take care of each other." "And Nora," she added, turning to embrace the other woman as well, "take care of my brother-in-law. He needs someone to remind him he's not invincible." Nora returned the embrace, throat tight with emotion. "I will, thank you for everything, Sarah." With final farewells exchanged, they mounted and set off, heading southeast toward Cheyenne. The journey would take 3 days of hard riding, Kieran explained, as they traveled 3 days during which they would be exposed and vulnerable to pursuit. They rode in silence for the first few hours, each lost in their own thoughts as the mountain terrain gradually gave way to rolling hills. Nathan took the lead, with Kieran bringing up the rear and Nora between them. The package that had caused so much trouble was secured inside Kieran's saddlebags, along with Thomas's letter and the other documents. By midday, they had covered significant ground, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. During a brief stop to rest the animals and eat a cold lunch, Nora found herself sitting beside Kieran on a fallen log, watching as Nathan checked their back trail for signs of pursuit. "What happens when we reach Cheyenne?" she asked quietly. "After we deliver the evidence to the marshal." Kieran was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "That depends," he said finally. "On what?" He turned to look at her then, his eyes searching her face. "On what you want to happen, Nora." The simple statement, loaded with unspoken meaning, made her heart beat faster. "What I want," Yes, Kieran's voice was low, intimate. When this is over, when you're safe from Wade, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? Nora hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead, too focused on immediate survival to consider a future beyond the danger. Now, faced with the question, she found herself without a clear answer. I don't know, she admitted. I could go to my sister in Boston, I suppose, start over there. Kieran nodded, his expression carefully neutral. Boston's a fine city from what I hear. Yes, it is. Nora studied his face, gathering her courage. But I'm not sure that's what I want anymore. Oh, a flicker of something hope perhaps crossed his features. What do you want then? Before Nora could answer, Nathan returned, his expression grave. Riders, he reported quietly. Following our trail, at least 3, maybe more. The moment broken, Kieran was on his feet instantly, all business once more. How far back? Hour, maybe less, they're pushing hard. Then so do we, Kieran decided, helping Nora to her feet. We need to reach the Thompson River crossing before they catch up. Better ground for defense if it comes to that. They mounted quickly and set off again, pushing the horses to a gallop wherever the terrain allowed. Nora's question remained unanswered, hanging between her and Kieran like an unfinished promise. What did she want? The answer was becoming clearer with each passing day, each shared danger, each moment in Kieran Ironwood's steadfast presence. But first they had to survive. The afternoon stretched into evening as they rode hard, the distant figures of their pursuers occasionally visible on the horizon behind them. The Thompson River crossing, when they reached it at dusk, proved to be a shallow ford with defensive high ground on the far side, exactly the advantage Kieran had hoped for. We make our stand here, he decided after a quick assessment. Nathan, take position up there. He pointed to a rocky outcropping overlooking the ford. I'll cover from those trees. Nora, stay with the horses behind that ridge. If things go badly, ride for Cheyenne. Don't look back. Nora wanted to protest, to insist on staying with them, but the logic of his plan was undeniable. Someone needed to get the evidence to the marshal if Kieran and Nathan fell. Still, the thought of leaving them, of Kieran facing danger without her beside him, made her physically ill. Be careful, she whispered as she prepared to take the horses to the sheltered position he'd indicated. Both of you? Always am, Kieran replied with a ghost of a smile. Then, to her surprise, he leaned forward and pressed a swift, hard kiss to her lips. For luck, he murmured as he pulled away, leaving Nora breathless and stunned. Before she could respond, he was gone, moving silently to take up his position among the trees. Nathan gave her a knowing look before heading to his own post, rifle in hand. Nora led the horses to the sheltered area behind the ridge, securing them where they wouldn't be visible from the ford. Then, against Kieran's instructions, she crept back to a position where she could see what was happening. The small pistol Sarah had given her clutched in her hand. Twilight deepened into dusk as they waited, the only sounds the soft rushing of the river and the occasional stamp of a restless horse. Then, in the gathering darkness, came the sound of approaching riders, not bothering with stealth now, confident in their pursuit. 3 men appeared at the opposite bank of the ford, exactly as Nathan had reported. They paused, studying the crossing with obvious suspicion. I don't like it, one said, voice carrying clearly across the water. Too perfect for an ambush. They came this way, another replied, indicating the tracks visible even in the fading light. No choice but to follow. The third man, larger than the others and wearing a distinctive flat-brimmed hat, made the decision. We cross, but careful like. Keep your eyes open. They urged their horses into the shallow water, moving slowly, weapons at the ready. Nora held her breath, watching as they made their way across, the water splashing around their horses' legs. They were halfway across when Kieran's voice rang out from the trees. That's far enough, the men froze, their hands moving toward their guns. We've got you covered from both sides, Kieran continued. Drop your weapons and you might live to see morning. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the man in the flat-brimmed hat made a sudden move, drawing his pistol with lightning speed. A shot cracked from Nathan's position, and the man cried out, clutching his shoulder as his gun fell into the river. The other two immediately opened fire, shooting blindly toward the trees where Kieran was hidden. Nora watched in horror as muzzle flashes lit the gathering darkness, the sound of gunfire echoing off the surrounding hills. One of the men suddenly slumped in his saddle, hit by one of Kieran's shots. The other, seeing his companions wounded, wheeled his horse around and spurred it back toward the far bank. Nathan's rifle cracked again, and the fleeing rider jerked but stayed in the saddle, disappearing into the darkness beyond the ford. "Nora," Kieran's voice called urgently. "Stay where you are." But Nora was already moving, running down toward the river where the two wounded men remained. One was clearly dead, slumped over his horse's neck. The other, the man in the flat-brimmed hat, was still upright but swaying, blood darkening his shirt from the wound in his shoulder. Kieran emerged from the trees, rifle aimed at the wounded man. "Drop your gun," he ordered, slowly. The man complied, his pistol falling into the shallow water with a splash. "You've made a mistake," he gasped, pain evident in his voice. "Wade won't stop. He'll send more men, better ones." "Let him," Kieran replied coldly. "By the time they find you, we'll be in Cheyenne, and your boss will be facing federal charges." The man laughed, a harsh, pained sound. "You think Wade doesn't have friends in the marshal's office. You think he can't reach you anywhere." Nathan approached from the other side, his rifle trained on the wounded man. "Get off the horse," he instructed, slowly. As the man dismounted, awkwardly due to his wounded shoulder, Nora finally reached the riverbank. Kieran shot her an exasperated look but didn't comment on her disobedience. "What's your name?" Nora asked the wounded man, surprising them all. He stared at her, confusion mingling with pain on his weathered face. "Carson," he finally replied. "Jim Carson." "Well, Mr. Carson," Nora said, drawing herself up to her full height, "I want you to deliver a message to Harlan Wade. Tell him the widow Linden says his ledgers make for very interesting reading. Tell him I've made copies and that they'll go to every newspaper in the territory if anything happens to me or my friends. Do you understand?" Carson's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, madam." "Good." Nora nodded toward his horse. "Now get on that animal and ride back to wherever you came from. And remember my message." Kieran and Nathan exchanged glances but didn't interfere as Carson awkwardly remounted his horse. "You're making a mistake letting me go," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Maybe," Kieran agreed. "But killing a man in cold blood isn't something I'm prepared to do today. Now ride before I change my mind." Carson didn't need to be told twice. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back across the ford, disappearing into the darkness beyond. "That was risky," Nathan observed once the sound of hoofbeats had faded. "He'll report back to Wade." "Yes," Nora agreed, "with my message and with the knowledge that we're willing to kill to protect ourselves and the evidence." Kieran was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprise, certainly, but also something like admiration. "That was quick thinking," he said, "but we should move on all the same. The third rider might bring back reinforcements." They retrieved their horses and continued on, traveling by moonlight for several more miles before making camp in a well-hidden ravine. The encounter at the ford had shaken them all, but also provided a strange sort of confidence. They had faced Wade's men and prevailed not without risk, but with surprisingly few casualties. As they sat around a small, carefully shielded fire, Nora found herself watching Kieran surreptitiously. The brief kiss before the confrontation had been unexpected and electrifying, awakening feelings she'd thought long buried. But there had been no opportunity to discuss it, no moment to ask what it meant to him. Nathan, noticing the tension between them, tactfully offered to take first watch, moving away to a position where he could observe the surrounding terrain without hearing their conversation. Left alone by the fire, Nora finally gathered her courage. "About what happened before the crossing," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran looked up from cleaning his rifle, his expression guarded. "The kiss." "Yes," Nora met his gaze steadily. "Why did you do that?" For a moment he seemed to struggle with himself, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Because I might not have gotten another chance," he finally said, "and I've been wanting to do it since the day we left Tumbleweed Creek. The The simple honesty of his admission stole Nora's breath. That long. Kieran set the rifle aside, his full attention now on her. Longer if I'm being completely honest, but it didn't seem right to say anything with you being recently widowed and in danger. And now, Nora asked, her heart racing. Now, Kieran said softly, I still don't know if it's right. But I do know that watching you stand up to Carson, seeing your courage and quick thinking, it made me realize that life's too short for regrets. Too short not to tell someone when you care for them. Nora moved closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I care for you too, Kieran, more than I thought possible after everything with Thomas. He reached out tentatively, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek. I'm not Thomas, he said, his voice low and intense. I won't make promises I can't keep, I won't lie to you or use you. What I offer is simple myself as I am, flawed, scarred, but honest. That's all I want, Nora whispered, leaning into his touch. Just you as you are. This time when his lips met hers, it wasn't a hasty, desperate kiss before battle. It was slow and deliberate, a promise exchanged without words. Nora's arms wound around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor, all the pent-up emotions of the past weeks finding release in this moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. When this is over, he murmured, when you're safe, I want you to stay, not because you need protection, but because you want to be with me. I want that too, Nora replied without hesitation. More than anything. A discreet cough from the darkness reminded them they weren't entirely alone. Nathan's voice drifted toward them, tinged with amusement. If you two are finished, I'd appreciate some relief on watch duty. Kieran laughed softly, pressing one more quick kiss to Nora's lips before rising to take his brother's place on watch. Get some sleep, he told her. We've still got a long journey ahead. Nora nodded, settling into her bedroll with a lighter heart than she'd had in months. Whatever dangers still lay ahead, she no longer faced them alone. And beyond the danger, for the first time since Thomas's death, no, if she was honest, for the first time since long before that she could see a future worth fighting for. The remaining journey to Cheyenne passed without further incident, though they maintained vigilant watch for any sign of pursuit. They traveled by day and camped by night, always choosing defensible positions and taking turns on watch. Nora and Kieran stole moments together when they could, a touch of hands as they passed food, a private smile across the campfire, and occasionally, when Nathan tactfully made himself scarce, a brief interlude of kisses and whispered promises. By the afternoon of the third day, the sprawling town of Cheyenne came into view, a bustling outpost of civilization with its railroad terminus, government buildings, and streets lined with businesses and homes. After days in the wilderness, the sight of so many people and buildings was almost overwhelming to Nora. We'll head straight for the marshal's office, Kieran decided as they rode into town, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Their trail-worn appearance and alert, wary postures marked them clearly as people who had traveled hard and faced danger. The federal marshal, a grizzled man named Harrington with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner, listened to their story with growing interest. When Nora produced the ledgers and deeds from Thomas's package, spreading them across his desk, his eyebrows rose visibly. Wade's been a thorn in our side for years, he acknowledged, examining the documents carefully, but he's always been too careful to leave evidence like this. Your husband did us a service, Mrs. Linden, whatever his original intentions. Then you'll act on this information, Nathan pressed. These people have been pursued, threatened. A man died in Tumbleweed Creek because of these documents. Marshal Harrington nodded gravely. I'll send a wire to Denver immediately. We'll have Wade in custody by tomorrow night. He looked up at Nora, but I'll need you to testify about how these documents came into your possession. Of course, Nora agreed, though the thought of facing Wade in court sent a chill through her. Whatever is necessary to see justice done. In the meantime, Harrington continued, I suggest you all stay out of sight. The Great Western Hotel has private rooms with separate entrances. I'll arrange accommodations for you there under assumed names. They left the marshal's office with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The evidence was now in official hands, which lifted an enormous burden from their shoulders. But until Wade was actually in custody, they remained at risk. The Great Western Hotel proved to be a respectable establishment near the center of town. As promised, Harrington had arranged adjoining rooms for them, accessible via a side entrance that allowed them to come and go without passing through the main lobby. "I'll check in with Harrington in the morning," Nathan said as they settled into their rooms, one for him, one for Kieran and Nora. If he had any thoughts about the propriety of this arrangement, he kept them to himself, for which Nora was grateful. "Try to get some rest, you've both earned it." After he retired to his own room, Nora found herself alone with Kieran for the first time in days. The hotel room, though simple, seemed luxurious after their nights on the trail, a real bed with clean linens, a washstand with hot water, even a small sitting area with 2 comfortable chairs. "I'd almost forgotten what civilization feels like," Nora remarked as she washed the trail dust from her face and hands. Kieran, checking the room's locks and windows out of habit, smiled at her over his shoulder. "Prefer the open country myself. But I won't say no to a real bed after days in the saddle." There was an awkward moment as they both glanced at the single bed dominating the room. Kieran cleared his throat. "I can sleep in the chair," he offered, "or we could ask for another room." Nora looked at him steadily, a decision forming in her mind. These past days had shown her what kind of man Kieran Ironwood truly was: honorable, brave, steadfast. She'd come to trust him in a way she'd never trusted Thomas, to care for him with a depth that surprised her. And though society might frown on a widow finding new love so quickly, Nora found she cared less and less for society's opinions. "I don't want another room," she said softly. "And I don't want you sleeping in a chair." Kieran's eyes darkened as he understood her meaning. "Nora," he began, his voice husky, "are you sure?" I know you don't," she interrupted, moving closer to him. "That's part of why I'm sure." She reached up to touch his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I've spent too much of my life doing what was expected, Kieran. Being the proper daughter, the dutiful wife. Look where it got me." She smiled ruefully. "I'm through with living by other people's rules. I want this, I want you." For a moment, Kieran seemed frozen, his eyes searching hers as if looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he let out a shaky breath, then pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. "I want you too," he murmured against her hair. "More than I've wanted anything in a very long time." Their lips met in a kiss that quickly deepened, months of suppressed desire finally finding release. Nora's hands moved to the buttons of his shirt as his tangled in her hair, both of them suddenly desperate for more contact, more closeness. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, pausing to explore newly revealed skin with hands and lips. Kieran's body was all lean muscle and old scars, a testament to the life he'd lived. Nora's was softer, bearing its own marks of experience, including a small, crescent-shaped scar above her hip from a childhood fall that made Kieran smile when he discovered it. "Beautiful," he whispered as he laid her gently on the bed, his eyes taking in every inch of her. "So beautiful." Nora had never felt particularly pretty, perhaps, in a conventional way, but not beautiful. Yet under Kieran's adoring gaze, she felt transformed, truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. What followed was unlike anything she'd experienced before. Thomas had been a perfunctory lover, more concerned with his own pleasure than hers. Kieran was attentive, responsive, finding joy in her reactions, in the small sounds she made when he touched her just right. He took his time, learning her body as thoroughly as if mapping an unexplored country, bringing her to heights of pleasure she hadn't known were possible. When they finally came together, moving as one beneath the clean hotel sheets, Nora felt as if something long broken inside her was finally healing. In Kieran's arms, with his name on her lips and his heart beating against hers, she found not just physical release but a profound emotional connection that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to remember. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Nora's head resting on Kieran's chest, his fingers gently combing through her hair. Outside, the sounds of Cheyenne at night drifted through the partially open window, distant piano music from a saloon, the occasional passing wagon, voices raised in laughter or argument. "What happens now?" Nora asked softly, tracing idle patterns on Kieran's skin. After Wade is arrested after the trial, Kieran was quiet for a moment, his hand still moving gently through her hair. "That depends," he finally said, "on what you want." Nora propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I want you," she said simply, "a life with you wherever that might be." A slow smile spread across Kieran's face, transforming it with boyish delight. "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached up to cup her cheek. "I'm not a wealthy man, Nora. I can't offer you fine things or an easy life." "I've had fine things," Nora replied. "They didn't make me happy." She turned her head to press a kiss to his palm. "I'd rather have a simple life with a good man than all the luxuries in the world with one I can't trust." Kieran's expression grew serious. "Nathan has offered me a partnership in the ranch," he said. "He and Sarah have been trying to start a family with no luck so far. They need help and—" he hesitated. "I think it's time I stopped running from the past, time I found a home again." "With me?" Nora asked, her heart swelling with hope. "With you," Kieran confirmed, "if you'll have me. If you're willing to be a rancher's wife with all the hard work and isolation that entails." Nora laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Kieran Ironwood, after everything we've been through together, do you really think I'm afraid of hard work or isolation?" She leaned down to kiss him softly. "Besides, it won't be isolated if we're together." He pulled her closer, kissing her with a passion that took her breath away. "Is that a yes, then?" he murmured against her lips. "Yes," Nora replied without hesitation. 1,000 times yes." They sealed the promise with another kiss, which might have led to more if not for a sudden sharp knock at their door. They sprang apart, Kieran reaching instinctively for his gun on the bedside table. "Who is it?" he called, signaling Nora to stay behind him as he pulled on his trousers. "Nathan," came the reply, his voice urgent. "Got news from Harrington." Kieran relaxed slightly but kept the gun in hand as he cracked open the door. Nathan's expression was grim as he entered, nodding briefly to Nora, who had hastily wrapped herself in a sheet. "Wade's gone," he announced without preamble. "Disappeared from Denver before the marshals could arrest him. Apparently, he liquidated his assets 2 days ago and vanished." "Damn," Kieran swore softly. "How? We only just delivered the evidence." Nathan shook his head. "Harrington thinks he might have had a warning from someone in Tumbleweed Creek, or maybe that third rider who escaped at the river crossing managed to get word to him somehow." "So he's still out there," Nora said, a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. "Still free to come after us." "Yes and no," Nathan replied. "He's a wanted man now. His face will be on posters from here to San Francisco. He can't operate openly anymore, can't access his usual resources. But he can still hire men to do his dirty work," Kieran pointed out. "And he knows exactly who to blame for his downfall." The implications hung heavy in the air. Their moment of victory and planning for the future had been shattered by this new development. Wade was still a threat, perhaps even more dangerous now that he had nothing left to lose. "What do we do now?" Nora asked, looking between the brothers. Kieran and Nathan exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Kieran spoke. "We go home," he said firmly. "Back to the ranch. It's defensible, remote. Wade would have a hard time finding us there, let alone reaching us." "And if he does find us," Nora pressed. "Then we'll be ready," Kieran said, his voice hardening. "I won't live in fear, Nora, and I won't let him dictate our future." He moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hand in his. "We stick to our plan, we build a life together. And we keep our eyes open." Nathan nodded in agreement. "The ranch is the safest place for all of us right now, and Harrington has promised to send word the moment they have any news of Wade's whereabouts." Nora looked at their joined hands, then up at Kieran's determined face. The future they'd just begun to envision now came with a shadow hanging over it, the possibility of Wade's revenge. But the alternative, separating, running, living in constant fear, was unthinkable. "All right," she said, squeezing Kieran's hand. "We go home." They left Cheyenne the following morning, having given their formal statements to Marshal Harrington and received his assurance that the hunt for Wade would continue until he was apprehended. The journey back to the Ironwood Ranch was made with heightened vigilance, but no sign of pursuit or danger. Sarah welcomed them back with obvious relief, embracing each of them in turn. "The ranch has been too quiet without you," she said, her eyes lingering on the way Kieran kept Nora close to his side, their hands frequently finding each other. "I see some things have changed while you were away." That evening, as they sat around the table sharing a celebratory meal, Kieran formally asked Nathan for partnership in the ranch. His brother accepted without hesitation, raising a toast to their new arrangement. Then, to Nora's surprise, Kieran turned to her, taking her hand in his. "Nora Linden," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nervousness, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me here, on this land, with these people as our family?" Though they had already discussed their future together, the formal proposal before Nathan and Sarah moved Nora deeply. "Yes," she answered, her voice clear and certain, "with all my heart, yes." The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and planning. The small cabin that had once housed hired hands was expanded and improved to become Kieran and Nora's home, until a larger house could be built the following year. Nora threw herself into learning the ways of ranch life, guided patiently by Sarah, while Kieran and Nathan worked to increase the ranch's security, adding more hands, improving sight lines, establishing protocols for approaching riders. They were married on a perfect June day, with a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher and witnessed by Nathan, Sarah, and the handful of ranch hands who had become like family. Nora wore a new dress that Sarah had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Kieran, clean-shaven and somewhat uncomfortable in his best shirt and new trousers, looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever seen. "I take you, Nora, to be my wife," he vowed, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "To stand beside you in good times and bad, to protect you with my life if need be, and to love you faithfully until my dying day." Nora's own vows were equally heartfelt, promising to be his partner in all things, to face whatever came their way with courage and faith, and to love him completely and without reservation for all the days they were granted together. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music provided by one of the hands who played fiddle and another who had a harmonica. They danced under the stars, ate Sarah's delicious cooking, and accepted well wishes from their small community with genuine gratitude. As night fell and they retired to their cabin, now decorated with small touches that made it truly their home, Kieran swept Nora into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ironwood," he said, setting her gently on her feet inside. "I like the sound of that," Nora replied, reaching up to wrap her arms around his neck. Nora Ironwood. Their kiss was tender at first, then quickly grew passionate as they celebrated their union in the most ancient and intimate way. Later, as they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, Nora traced the familiar lines of Kieran's face with gentle fingers. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. "About taking on a widow with dangerous enemies," Kieran captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Not a single one," he assured her. "You're worth any risk, Nora, always will be." In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm of hard work and simple pleasures. Nora adapted to ranch life with surprising ease, finding satisfaction in tasks she'd never imagined herself doing, helping with calving, keeping the books for the ranch, even learning to ride astride like a proper rancher's wife. The land that had seemed so foreign when she first arrived gradually became home, its vast beauty and ever-changing moods seeping into her soul until she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Kieran flourished in his renewed partnership with Nathan, the brothers working together with the easy communication of men who knew each other's minds and strengths. The tension that had separated them for years melted away as they built something together, something that would last beyond their lifetimes. The shadow of Harlan Wade never fully disappeared. They received occasional updates from Marshall Harrington, possible sightings in California, rumors of Wade joining a gang in Arizona territory, whispers of his death in Mexico. None were ever confirmed. But as time passed, and no vengeance materialized, the fear gradually receded, becoming just one more thread in the tapestry of their shared history rather than the dominant pattern. When winter came, bringing snow that transformed the ranch into a pristine wonderland, Nora discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought joy beyond measure to the entire household, with Sarah weeping happy tears and Nathan slapping his brother on the back so hard Kieran nearly fell over. A child, Kieran marveled that night as they lay together, his hand gentle on Nora's still flat stomach. Our child. The first of many, I hope, Nora replied, covering his hand with her own. This place should be filled with children, with laughter and new beginnings. Kieran's eyes, when he looked at her, held all the love and wonder she could ever have wished for. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed. After Hannah died after the war, I thought that part of life was closed to me. And now, Nora prompted, though she knew the answer. Now, he said, pulling her closer, I can't imagine any other life, any other future. You've given me everything, Nora, everything that matters. As spring arrived, bringing new calves and green grass to the valley, Nora's pregnancy progressed without complications. Her body changed, growing round with new life, and Kieran watched the transformation with awe and devotion, treating her as if she were made of the most delicate porcelain while respecting her determination to continue contributing to the ranch's operation as long as she was able. It was during these months that Nora finally wrote to her sister Catherine in Boston, breaking the long silence between them. She told Catherine everything about Thomas's betrayal and death, about Wade and the danger, but mostly about Kieran and the new life they were building together, the child they were expecting. The letter, when it arrived, was a bridge across years of misunderstanding and hurt, an olive branch extended in hope of reconciliation. Catherine's reply came faster than expected, filled with relief that Nora was safe and well, with apologies for the judgment that had driven them apart, and with excitement about her impending aunthood. She promised to visit after the baby's birth, to meet the man who had given her sister the happiness she'd always deserved, but never found with Thomas. On a perfect July morning, with sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and birdsong filling the air, Nora gave birth to a daughter. Sarah and the midwife from the nearest town helped with the delivery, while Kieran paced anxiously outside, driven from the room by the midwife's firm insistence that men were more hindrance than help in such matters. When at last he was allowed to enter, Kieran approached the bed where Nora lay with their daughter cradled in her arms with a look of such reverence that it brought tears to her eyes. She's perfect, he whispered, gently touching the downy dark hair that already showed signs of his own coloring. Just like her mother. Would you like to hold her? Nora asked, smiling at his obvious awe. Kieran hesitated, suddenly looking uncertain. I've never held a baby before. What if I do it wrong? You won't, Nora assured him. Just support her head and hold her close to your body. With infinite care, Kieran took the tiny bundle from Nora's arms, cradling his daughter against his chest. The baby opened her eyes, already showing hints of Nora's deep blue, and seemed to study her father's face with serious concentration. Hello, little one, Kieran murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your pa. The simple words, the perfect tableau of father and daughter meeting for the first time, filled Nora with a happiness so profound it seemed almost too much for one heart to contain. This was what she had traveled so far to find, through danger and grief and uncertainty, this moment, this man, this love that had created a new life and a new beginning. They named the baby Hannah Kieran Ironwood, honoring both Kieran's past and Nora's family ties. The name felt right, a bridge between what had been lost and what had been found, between sorrow and joy, between the paths that had led them to each other. Catherine arrived from Boston a month later, a whirlwind of Eastern sophistication and genuine warmth, who immediately fell in love with her niece and developed an unexpected rapport with Sarah. She stayed for 3 weeks, helping with the baby, exploring the ranch with increasing appreciation for its wild beauty, and getting to know the man her sister had married. "I was wrong about Thomas," she admitted to Nora on the eve of her departure. "But you were right to follow your heart. It led you here to this place, to Kieran." She smiled, watching as Kieran rocked the baby on the porch, singing a soft lullaby. "He's a good man, Nora, the kind who stands beside you through anything." "I know," Nora replied, her heart full. "That's exactly what he's done from the very beginning." As autumn painted the valley in golds and crimsons, bringing the cattle down from summer pastures and filling the storerooms with preparations for winter, Nora often found herself pausing in her tasks to simply absorb the life around her. Nathan and Sarah, still hoping for a child of their own but finding joy in their role as aunt and uncle. The ranch hands who had become extended family, who treated little Hannah as a collective treasure. And Kieran, always Kieran, working from dawn to dusk but never too tired to spend time with his daughter, to hold his wife close in the quiet moments before sleep. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery hues, Hannah sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside them, Kieran reached for Nora's hand. "You ever wonder," he asked, "what would have happened if you'd left Tumbleweed Creek alone that day?" "If I hadn't followed you," Nora considered the question, thinking back to that morning that now seemed a lifetime ago, the whispers, the shame, the desperate plan to slip away unnoticed. "I would have gone to Boston, I suppose," she said finally. "Tried to rebuild my life there, always looking over my shoulder for Wade's men." "Would you have been happy?" Kieran pressed. "Safe, perhaps, but happy?" Nora shook her head. "No, I wouldn't have known what I was missing, but I wouldn't have had this." She gestured to encompass their home, their sleeping daughter, the ranch spread out before them. "I wouldn't have had you." Kieran's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her close against his side. "That day you were packing to leave town," he confessed, "I stood outside your door for nearly 10 minutes before I knocked, wondering if I was making a mistake, if I had any right to insert myself into your troubles." "What made you knock?" Nora asked, curious about this detail she'd never known. Kieran was quiet for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "I saw you earlier that day," he said finally. "Walking through town with your head held high despite the whispers, despite the sideways looks. I saw your courage, your dignity. And I thought, there goes a woman who deserves better than what this town is giving her." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. "I couldn't let you leave like that, in shame and alone, not without offering another way." "Not without you beside me," Nora murmured, echoing the words he'd spoken that day when he'd insisted on accompanying her. "Not without me beside you," Kieran agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made." As darkness settled over the valley and the stars emerged in full brilliance above the mountains, Nora leaned into her husband's embrace, surrounded by the life they had built together from the ashes of her shame and his loneliness. Whatever the future held, the joys and sorrows, the challenges and triumphs that were the lot of any life fully lived, they would face it as they had faced everything since that fateful day in Tumbleweed Creek. Together, side by side, with courage and with love. And that, Nora knew with bone-deep certainty, was all that truly mattered.